Welcome back to our exploration of the PCUSA Old School of 1838. In part one, we unraveled the foundational DNA of the conservative traditionalists, examining their unbending devotion to the Westminster Standards. We witnessed a massive storm gathering over the early American religious landscape as two completely incompatible structural visions for the Christian faith fought aggressively for denominational control. Now, the abstract theoretical debates give way to active, high-stakes combat. Part 2 tracks the explosive operational friction forcing a permanent administrative fracture during the General Assemblies. This was an era where critical theological disagreements were aggressively weaponized within the church's judicial systems, forcing every single minister, elder, and congregant to choose a side. From frontier heresy trials to property battles in the Supreme Court, this chapter examines how the old school executed an institutional purge to protect its historic confessional borders. Before structural separation could occur on a corporate scale, the brewing theological conflict was aggressively weaponized within the church's judicial systems. High-profile trials served as real-world testing grounds. These intense legal battles thoroughly convinced the old school camp that the new school was actively compromising the church's integrity and that regional bodies were no longer reliable. The primary legal proxy battle centered directly on Albert Barnes, the pastor of the influential First Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia. Barnes was brought to trial for heresy. This specific trial by his presbytery followed the controversial publication of his work, Notes on Romans. The core prosecution targeted his explicit denial of immediate imputation. This stance directly challenged a cornerstone of the Westminster Standards. The case did not remain a local matter. It triggered a protracted multi-year appeals process. This complex case wound its way directly to the floor of the General Assembly. This drawn-out conflict forced every single minister and elder to choose sides. This judicial battle drastically polarized the opposing factions across the nation, demonstrating that the theological rift had moved past the point of any casual or friendly reconciliation. Simultaneously, theological warfare erupted on the Western frontier. In 1835, Lyman Beecher, the president and theology professor at Lane Seminary, was officially arraigned for heresy and slander. The charges were leveled by the undisputed champion of Midwestern Old School orthodoxy, Joshua Lacey Wilson, who asserted that Beecher had deceptive motives in his Presbyterian pulpit. Though the regional synod ultimately acquitted Lyman Beecher, the controversial verdict backfired on the new school. Instead of calming the waters, Beecher's acquittal deeply alarmed traditionalists. It provided stark evidence to the traditionalist camp that regional synods and the General Assembly were losing either the theological will or the institutional capability to act. They realized the ruling bodies could no longer police doctrinal boundaries effectively. This realization rendered a structural purge the only viable solution left for the denomination. The intellectual weight of mid-19th century Old School Presbyterianism was anchored by two titan figures, Charles Hodge in the north and James Henley Thornwell in the south. Together, these two brilliant traditionalist theologians provided the systematic and ecclesiastical framework that sustained the entire conservative old school movement for a generation. Rising from humble origins in South Carolina, James Henley Thornwell rapidly became the most influential and intellectually gifted Southern minister before the outbreak of the Civil War. Appointed the youngest ever moderator of the General Assembly in 1847 at age 35, he went on to occupy the prestigious chair of theology at Columbia. From 1855 to 1862, James Henley Thornwell injected a fierce confessional self-consciousness into Southern Presbyterianism, arguing that the church possessed a specific supernatural commission. He firmly maintained this unique spiritual commission must be executed strictly via the ordained ministry and precise elder oversight across all the growing Southern regional congregations. When the nation fractured in 1861, he led the formation of the Southern Presbyterian Church, authoring the historic address defending their corporate separation from the North. Princeton Theological Seminary stood as the undisputed capital of Northern Old School thought. Originally founded under the steady orthodox direction of the venerable scholar Archibald Alexander, the institution achieved global academic renown through Charles Hodge, who for over half a century trained generations of ministers in what became known as the Princeton Theology. This academic framework coupled Scottish common-sense realism with an unbending commitment to historic Calvinism, defending traditional Reformed theology against modern, contemporary philosophical trends. His monumental three-volume systematic theology served as the definitive textbook for Old School orthodoxy, providing an exhaustive defense of biblical inspiration and absolute divine authority. The intellectual footprint was widened by Robert Louis Dabney in Virginia, who reinforced the Princeton theology throughout the South, utilizing traditional European textbooks to train clergy. Operating out of Kentucky, Stuart Robinson fiercely championed the strict spiritual nature of the church's power, fighting to keep the bluegrass region aligned with strict Presbyterian polity. Together, these leaders functioned in unison to convince congregations they were not squabbling over technicalities, but were actively defending the historic global legacy of the Protestant Reformation. The Old School positioned itself in direct opposition to popular trends defining 19th century American Protestantism, viewing rising cross-denominational efforts and unity movements with severe protective skepticism. From their perspective, widespread interdenominational cooperation did not strengthen the Christian witness. Instead, it dangerously diluted the distinct confessional truths of the Church and directly threatened its institutional purity. This protective mindset drove the Old School to actively oppose independent, voluntary, and benevolent societies, which had grown highly popular for advancing causes like abolition, temperance, and foreign missions. Old School leaders recognized that these independent societies operated entirely outside the authority of any ecclesiastical court, being accountable to no church or traditional confessional system of governance. These organizations were viewed as a direct threat to official Presbyterian agencies actively competing for the financial resources and loyalty of local congregations while undermining structured church enterprises. The underlying conflict over these boards stemmed from a fundamental disagreement regarding the role of the church, pitting New School defenders of voluntary societies against strict Old School traditionalists. The Old School was fully consumed with protecting the church's exclusive right to govern its own mission work, asserting that sending out missionaries belonged solely to the church institution. Turning these vital operations over to independent interdenominational agencies was fiercely viewed by traditionalists as an unconscionable and highly dangerous abdication of their divinely appointed corporate mandate. This commitment to institutional boundaries made Old School theologians exceptionally thorough in their opposition to several 19th century attempts to merge American Presbyterians and New England Congregationalists into one body. Traditionalists recognized that such a merger would permanently alter the landscape of the church, cementing the structural irregularities of the plan of union and rendering strict confessional subscription impossible. They chose to preserve a smaller, doctrinally pure denomination over a larger, structurally compromised ecumenical alliance, successfully safeguarding their historic Calvinist heritage from modernizing trends and compromise. The internal dividing lines within the PCUSA did not merely mirror abstract theological differences, they also reflected distinct regional and cultural boundaries across a rapidly dividing nation. Although Princeton Theological Seminary served as the primary intellectual powerhouse, the movement's operational strength was heavily concentrated within the southern states, while the New School dominated the North. The rapid expansion of Old School Calvinism across the South was heavily accelerated by the influence of Princeton theology and the dense classical scholasticism of Francis Turretin. Turretin's traditional Latin textbook was utilized as the standard dogmatic authority in major Presbyterian seminaries across Virginia and South Carolina, anchoring students in a highly structured orthodoxy. These traditional convictions were systematically reinforced by the region's two dominant theologians, James Henley Thornwell and Robert Louis Dabney, who fiercely insulated the Southern Church from modernizing trends. Despite sharing a common commitment to the Westminster standards, Southern Old School thinkers diverged from their Northern Princeton allies on key practical aspects of traditional church ecclesiology. Their unique divergence focused particularly on the practical execution of the spirituality of the church, a doctrine which took on a highly defensive cultural character across the South. By arguing that the church lacked biblical jurisdiction to comment on secular political issues, Southern Presbyterians effectively insulated the region's distinct social institutions from any direct ecclesiastical critique. In practice, this allowed congregations to maintain deeply conservative positions on volatile issues of the day, protecting existing economic structures like chattel slavery from formal denominational interference. Simultaneously, this defensive framework allowed Southern courts to enforce strict traditional views regarding women's suffrage, temperance, and absolute Sabbath observance without any outside interference from Northern factions. By the late 1830s, accumulating friction over theological innovations, frontier polity, and independent societies reached an institutional breaking point, splitting American Presbyterianism into rival denominations. The brewing ideological conflict rapidly transformed into a permanent administrative fracture during the intense General Assemblies of 1837 and 1838, forever changing the national denomination. The initial structural blow fell during the May 1837 General Assembly, where the conservative Old School faction successfully marshaled a decisive, historically significant voting majority. Moving swiftly to protect confessional integrity, the conservative majority declared the historic 1801 Plan of Union unconstitutional, rendering it completely null and void from its inception. Building upon this legal premise, Old School forces passed the controversial Exscinding Acts, arguing that any ecclesiastical body organized under its frontier provisions was fundamentally invalid. Through this legislative maneuver, the Assembly summarily targeted and expelled 4 northern synods, a massive geographic purge that drastically shifted the institutional balance of power. The extended New School leadership refused to accept their summary expulsion in silence meeting in Auburn, New York, to organize an official defense against heresy accusations. The resulting Auburn Declaration served as a public vindication, arguing that their teachings were fully compatible with the standards, helping the faction solidify their internal identity. The definitive separation occurred at the Seventh Presbyterian Church during the opening session of the May 1838 General Assembly, where the clerk refused to seat commissioners. This refusal produced immediate procedural chaos on the assembly floor, triggering loud protests as New School delegates took matters directly into their own hands amidst the turmoil. The New School delegates formally declared their own moderator, turned their backs on the platform, and marched out of the historic building in a grand unified body. The departing faction proceeded down the street to the First Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia, where they formally constituted their own parallel, fully functioning General Assembly. From that momentous hour, 2 distinct ecclesiastical bodies operated under the identical name of the PCUSA, each claiming to be the sole legitimate heir to the legacy. The split triggered protracted litigation over property and trust funds, culminating in the landmark Pennsylvania Supreme Court case, which ultimately validated the maneuvers of the 1837 Assembly. This victory secured their assets, but could not insulate them from wider national storms. The New School split in 1857, while the Old School fractured in 1861. The Old School perspective operated as a dominant force within American Protestantism for a generation, but its institutional isolation began to erode in decades following the Civil War. The intense theological controversies that had fractured the denomination in 1837 gradually lost their urgency when confronted by immense social and spiritual crises of a reconstructed nation. The primary blow to the Northern Old School occurred in 1869, when northern branches of both Old and New School churches formally reunited, ending decades of administrative separation. The massive cultural shocks of the war era had shifted the church's core attention away from mid-century disputes regarding the precise mechanics of original sin and human depravity. Delegates also looked past old debates regarding the exact extent of the atonement, choosing cooperative efficiency over the rigid theological boundaries that once defined their entire confessional identity. Despite a determined rearguard action led by Charles Hodge, who warned that the new school's understanding of confessional subscription remained dangerously loose, the drive for reunion successfully won the day. The two traditions merged, effectively diluting the distinct, isolated confessionalism that had fiercely characterized the Old School of 1838, absorbing their strict heritage into the broader denominational mainstream. While the Northern tradition integrated back into the mainstream, the distinct divine right ecclesiology of the Southern faction stubbornly followed a completely different, independent institutional path for generations. The Southern branch solidified its institutional identity as the PCUS, operating strictly on James Henley Thornwell's unique ecclesiological tenets well into the latter half of 20th century church history. Furthermore, the intellectual heritage of the Old School experienced a major, powerful revival during the intense fundamentalist modernist controversies that erupted during the early decades of the 20th century. J. Gresham Machen, a professor of New Testament at Princeton Seminary, drew directly upon Old School Presbyterian polity to lead the conservative resistance against rising theological modernism. When Machen's eventual trial and suspension catalyzed another major secession from the mainline church, his legal defense relied heavily on theological foundations laid down by historic Princeton scholars. His defense directly utilized the intellectual arguments of Archibald Alexander, Charles Hodge, and James Henley Thornwell to justify separating from a compromising, modernizing denominational structure. Although 1838 institutional boundaries eventually faded, the core conviction that the church is a uniquely supernatural institution bound to its confessional standards continues to serve as a foundational blueprint today. The fracture of 1838 was not just an administrative dispute, it was a fundamental war over the very ownership of truth and divine order across the growing American Republic. When we look back at the rigid boundaries drawn by the Old School, we are forced to confront how we evaluate theological integrity in our own contemporary eras. Are we currently witnessing a modern, highly divisive echoing of this very same structural and confessional fracturing in our contemporary religious and social institutions today? If you had been sitting in the pews of the Seventh Presbyterian Church in May 1838, would you have marched out the doors with the Reformers? Or would you have resolutely stayed behind with the traditionalists, choosing to preserve a smaller, doctrinally pure denomination over a structurally compromised, larger ecumenical alliance? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. At what exact point does a compromise made for cultural relevance transform into an outright betrayal of core conviction? Join us next week for an in-depth exploration of the opposing side, the New School PCUSA of 1838, shifting our focus to the expanding Western frontier. We will discover how the New School movement championed adaptive evangelism, leaned into democratic optimism, and sought to completely reshape the alternative vision for the American faith. Subscribe to Theology today to ensure you never miss an episode of our deep dive historical analyses. Hit the notification bell to stay updated with our weekly production pipeline.